And again, I've been quite fortunate having served on President Ramaphosa's 4IR Commission. Cisco allowed me to actually serve on the commission, and I actually chaired the policy and regulation work stream. What I like is what he's done. And I know, again, this has been something that has been said before, but what I like is that he's also now taken the information regulator, he's taken ICASA, and he's actually collaborated and actually collapsed these into one, which also makes for quicker decision making. So it doesn't move from one body to the next. Technology is accelerating at such a phenomenal pace. Sometimes I don't even think that we understand that, yes, we are keeping up.
Hello and welcome to this latest episode of ITWeb TV. My name is Charmaine. When you think about policy and policymakers, I'm sure the thing that comes to mind is technocrats in navy blue suits or beige suits in archaic buildings, right? Well, I mention this because with all the buzz around generative AI, there's also been a lot of buzz around policy. And with the AU AI Act becoming a legislation, there's a lot of talk around where South Africa stands or where the continent is around policy in terms of artificial intelligence. Today in studio, I'm joined by Charmaine Houvet, who is the Senior Director of Government Strategy and Policy at Cisco Africa. Charmaine joins me to discuss the policy landscape in South Africa and all things ICT. Charmaine, welcome.
Thank you, Simnikife. Thank you so much for having me. And by the way, I can wholeheartedly agree when you talk about how policy makers, policy leaders, and policy diplomats are actually perceived. I was recently called a policy diplomat or tech diplomat, and I thought, oh wow, that sounds quite interesting. But actually, it's a very interesting role. I was telling my mentees this morning that I get to meet heads of state, I get to meet regulators, policymakers, I get to travel to really cool countries across the continent and globally, all in the pursuit of fair, transparent policy and regulation.
So policy isn't all that boring.
Absolutely not.
And you'll tell us all about it, Charmaine. So just to kick us off, Charmaine, just when we look at the stage that we're in, right? We're in a stage of digital maturity, and so within the context of South Africa, it's important for us to remain competitive. And I want to hear from you, how are our policymakers knowledgeable enough to set the rules and guardrails in terms of, how when we look at how technology is evolving and at the pace at which it's evolving?
Awesome. So Simnikiwe, something I am always pursuing and encouraging is collaboration and consultation, because I don't believe that it's up to one entity or one stakeholder to lead and drive any sorts of policy change or review or regulation. And something I've always respected of South African policymakers in particular, because I've had the opportunity to work with them for close to 35 years. Yes, a lot of the leaders have changed over time, but the constant is always at the Director General, the Director level, and the Councillor level when it comes to ICASA. And they have always been very conscious and intentional about consultation. So it's not about how knowledgeable they are. Yes, maybe that plays a huge factor, but I believe that when it comes to very important factors of benchmarking, of technology, policy review, of consultation with an ecosystem of stakeholders ranging from us as operators or us as technology companies, as OEMs, as thought leaders, bringing in community, bringing in civil society, bringing in academia, and a whole host of other players. That's where I believe the real competitive advantage is for South Africa and the continent at large.
You actually kind of answered my second question, because it was around what the role of a Cisco, the company that you work for, like what in providing guidance in that in policy making. You speak about, collaboration. That's where you're finding, opportunities as such. So where does Cisco sit in terms of, influencing how things go around policy making or policy development? If you can share anything with us.
We're quite fortunate in that Cisco is perceived as a thought leader when it comes to be it policy, regulation, AI, and a whole host of other advancements in the sector. And again, I've been quite fortunate having served on President Ramaphosa's 4IR Commission. Cisco allowed me to actually serve on the commission, and I actually chaired the policy and regulation work stream. And it was such an opportunity for me not to just serve the country, but bring the power of Cisco to the table. Again, I am backed up by a team of experts within Cisco, ranging from Washington through to Europe, all across the Middle East, APJC. I've got a whole host of colleagues who are experts in cloud data policy, AI, cybersecurity, IoT, smart cities, spectrum, connectivity, networking, sustainability. And I bring the power of those diverse colleagues with diverse views. I bring the power of Cisco when it comes to transparent and very visible frameworks, secure frameworks and policies and guidelines that we actually draft, that we actually collaborate and partner with governments globally. And I'm fortunate enough to actually be invited to a seat at the table with policymakers, regulators, with other industry players, industry associations, and act as a thought leader and act as a sounding board when it comes to how do we advance certain policies, or how do we actually begin to draft new policies, or how do we even overall certain of the policies that are quite advanced in the sector. So definitely we're seen as a thought leader, and I think we're also seen as a very key partner and collaborator.
And I suppose it's good to have those different voices, right? Like I'm sure shaping, like to kind of not necessarily shape, but to kind of advise or bring the expertise that you mentioned. And I think you also spoke about, strengths around, spectrum, data and cloud and what we're seeing around that. So, but here in South Africa, we know that there's national data and cloud policy that's just, enforced, or like
it's done the reports. And I know, again, we were quite instrumental in giving input into that as well.
Okay, so what I wanted to ask then, what is, where like when we look at all our policies and where we are, where do we need to sharpen or get right? What would you say is that? Not necessarily about the national and data cloud policy, but just in
general. So definitely in general, when it comes to policy crafting, when it comes to global best practice, one of the areas, again, where I have observed in my many years in the sector where we excel is traveling to ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, and leaning into best practice, tapping into what other countries across the globe are doing. We are brilliant in that. In fact, we often have, as South Africa, a permanent seat at many of these associations, and in most instances, we even have a lot of our policymakers, regulators chairing some of these key committees and key seats. And that's a big tick for us. And I think, yes, please continue. In terms of ensuring that there is large-scale consultation, inviting all of us to the table to give our input, I think we could do so much better at that because, yes, whilst there is consultation, it takes a very long time for the policymaker regulator to take into account all of this input. And again, there's often what I pick up a very underlying sort of trust deficit when it comes to, well, everyone who has a seat at the table, are we all acting in the best interests of the country? Are we acting in the best interests? Or are we acting in the best interests of the organization? So definitely when a consultative forum is called and we all give input, we need to move much quicker from policy to execution. So oftentimes we get stuck in policy. And again, I could argue we have some of the best in the leading minds in South Africa when it comes to policy formation. I've had the opportunity to work with people like Dr. Andile Ngaba, who's a brilliant mind in terms of leading some of these policy engagements and discussions. DG Nonkobela Jordan Diani, she's been absolutely phenomenal, a constant in the sector, leading in terms of how we actually give input. But again, that process, once it's done and we've got these amazing, phenomenal policies, we need to get to a stage of execution, and we also need to get to a stage of review and constant revisiting to see if they still are effective.
And does that speak to the fact that at the pace at which technology is advancing, that we need to, the pace needs to be a bit...
Exactly, Simnika, you hit the nail on the head. In fact, I loved what the current chairperson of ICASA shared on the sidelines of Africa Tech. He was actually recommending that with the advancement of technology, and if we look at the constant evolution of and the proliferation of the different technologies, especially with the advancement of IR technologies, with artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, etc. He was saying it's high time that South Africa as a whole overhauled the majority of their policies and the regulation. And he was actually saying, if you look at the EC Act, it's been some time where, we gave significant input and, we're still at that stage where we're still consulting, but it's a high time that we actually need to start executing on some of those. And I agree with the chairperson wholeheartedly.
But then, Charmaine, is there not a problem where it's going to be, this is what is being said, but then there's no action? There's also that we all of these things are mentioned in on big stages, big conferences, but then getting the will for people to actually act on it. How do we address that? Or is it something that you've seen that, like you mentioned, that pace needs to be more, but how do we move that conversation in terms of the ECA Act from what the chairperson said to actual action?
What I like is what he's done. And I know, again, this has been something that has been said before, but what I like is that he's also now taken the information regulator, he's taken ICASA, and he's actually collaborated and actually collapsed these into one, which also makes for quicker decision making. So it doesn't move from one body to the next, So I think that is now something that's, I think, one of the opportunities to also move at speed. And I'm also starting to see much more of, I think, ease in terms of how we're collaborating. A week ago, Cisco actually convened a number of players, operators. We actually convened the Department of Communications Digital Technologies, their head of AI frameworks, in a conversation. We had the chairperson from SABRIC, the banking regulator. We had AU and a whole host of others. We convened a roundtable conversation to talk exactly about these things. And again, a brilliant contributor to the ICT landscape, Miss Alison Gilwood, Dr. Alison Gilwood was present in the conversation as well as Ms. Kusile, who was the chairperson of the portfolio committee. We had all of these bright minds together, just asking the very same question of how do we stop being intentional about actually accelerating a lot of these conversations. And let's also not fall into the trap where a lot of us have become so paranoid and become so overly aware of, let's overregulate AI. When do we regulate? It's regulated today. But just Tracy, when we start asking what aspects of AI do you want to regulate and how do you want to regulate it and for what purpose do you want to regulate it, then it's very difficult to get answers to that. So how do we ensure that we work as an ecosystem to convene these required conversations? And how do we ensure that when we convene these conversations, we actually meeting for an objective and purpose of actually contributing to the advancement of the sector and not limiting or trying to stop something that we're still trying to figure out.
I like the part about AI. We'll get to AI in a we'll get to AI in a bit because you raised some very interesting points around that. I was at a conference and one of the researchers that I spoke to on the sidelines was saying about we must also be careful not to regulate for the sake of regulation. Like, yes, AI is, it's advancing, or like Gen AI particularly is advancing and all of that, but let's not just jump and everyone. Regulation is important, but let's also just understand that you shouldn't be doing it for the sake of doing it. Why are we doing it? You need to answer those questions of why are we doing it?
Correct.
or who does it benefit, the fact that we're doing this, and all of that. Yeah, no, we'll get to AI because it's one of those. Charmaine, Cisco is a US company, and without being political, but we just have to ask this one. Looking at, previously with the previous Trump administration, when the now in what do you call them again?
The president-elect.
The president-elect, yes, that's the president. He had the Clean Network program in the US under his administration, and which created opportunities, obviously, for American vendors and American companies or OEMs. What I want to hear from you is that, moving forward in terms of what are your thoughts on how this, when as the president-elect, as he comes back into being president, how does that play out for Cisco? What are you guys observing around that? And yes, how does Cisco, where are you positioned within that regard?
Again, in terms of policy, in terms of any type of sort of administration, it's a bit quite early to tell. But one of the things that we are quite comfortable about is that we have, under previous, correctly, so as you say, under a previous President Trump administration, worked brilliantly with the administration. And even in terms of some of the technology policies or just even some of the regulations, because we actually adopt policy, we adopt regulation, not from a US perspective and a US stance, but according to the countries in which we operate, and that's our guiding principle. So the thing that makes us successful is that we don't have a one-size-fits-all approach to how we operate in country. We don't have a one-size-fits-all approach to our skills, to our leadership, to our development. We genuinely do meet the criteria of the regulator of the day, of the policymaker, of the ecosystems in which we operate. And of course, something that we're very intentional about doing, and South Africa is a key case in point, not just South Africa, but Kenya, Botswana, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Cote d'Ivoire. We actually are intentional about coming into country, meeting with the head of state or meeting with the ICT minister or the director general and sitting down and saying, take us through your priorities and objectives for the country. We did it with the National Development Plan 2030. We had the honor of meeting with the former DPME Minister Jeff Houvet, Minister Jeff Houvet, as well as Trevor Manuel. And both Chuck Robbins, our global CEO and chairperson, and Frank Katsoudas, our Africa sponsor and executive vice president, we literally had an engagement around what was the context around NDP 2030. What were the objectives? Do you believe you're meeting them? How then do we move forward? What are some of the policy priorities and prerogatives that you believe a Cisco needs to come into country and address? And off the bat of that was how we started our whole country digital acceleration program in this country in 2019 with the then Minister of ICT, Minister Stella Ndabeni-Abrams. So again, that entire program, crafting it, the ideation, the objectives that were outlined, how we implemented it, where we implemented it, the communities we targeted, the programs in the entire country digital acceleration program was not thought out by Cisco. We actually had brainstorming meetings with the presidency, we had brainstorming meetings with Minister Stella Ndabeni-Abrams and her entire team. It resulted in President Ramaphosa meeting with Frank Katsoudas and Chuck Robbins and signing off on the agreement moving forward and how we would actually execute in country based on NDP 2030 imperatives. And that's how we go through for each and every country. We need to meet with the leader. We need to meet with the leaders. We need to meet with the decision makers. And that's how we actually take up our assignment and execute.
And why is it important for the company to do it in that manner? Like, I suppose it's because every country has different needs.
Exactly. And each and every country has, and what I always find interesting, again, Simnikiwe, on the continent, I love the rhythm and the discipline that I've bumped across. So if you go to Kenya and you speak to the leader of the country and you say, I'm looking to work with you on understanding what are your imperatives, the first thing they take out is, here is our vision 2030. You go to the African Union, you travel to Ethiopia, here's our vision for a prosperous and united continent for 2063. It's very rare that I've gone into any African country and they've had to scramble to look for vision objective. And oftentimes when you look at Cote d'Ivoire, you look at Kenya, you look at Ethiopia, you look at Botswana, you look at Rwanda, all of these countries that we are very present, very active, working with leaders. It's very rare that you get a copy-paste request from the leaders. Something that's been consistent for me, though, when I look at requests that have come from these leaders, is the focus on cybersecurity resilience. That's been the one, and digital skills acceleration. Those two are big asks.
And those are big asks for the continent as a whole.
Or the continent as a whole. And not just Africa, but globally.
Yeah.
From Cisco. A big ask from us globally is, can Cisco guide and help us around how do we protect our people, our processes? How do we protect our infrastructure, our assets? And how do you help us just in terms of ensuring that our government leaders, our citizens, our corporates are actually digitally skilled with the latest skills? And that's where for us, our Networking Academy Global program has proven to be so powerful.
Okay. And Charmaine, just to go back to, you mentioned, we spoke about the importance of policy and regulation and all of that, but we also seeing a lot of talk around ethics and bias in terms of tech evolution and where we are, and that needs to be like, it's kind of positioned as it needs to be like at the center, that when you are coming up with these policies, that you have to make sure that there's no, like, when tech is advancing, that there are no biases against certain groups of people or certain yes, let me just leave it at that. But how do then policymakers ensure that they get the balance right, where it's we are regulating, but we also need to make sure that what we are doing doesn't exclude certain groups and it doesn't favor certain groups?
And that's where instead of over-regulation, that's where what we recommend is, how about we start off with a guiding framework and guiding principles of transparency, of ethics, of security, and then again the whole thread throughout all of this is consultation. And most importantly, that's where you'll hear a lot about activities like sandboxing and activities like public-private partnerships, because this is where a lot of these things get tested out. And most importantly, again, something that Cisco is quite alive to is the full spectrum diversity consultation process throughout. Because for us, it's all about how do we ensure that from veterans to women to the youth, everybody is involved in the consultation process. And you are spot on. You are so right when it comes to how we actually govern. We are led by these set of principles. And then most importantly, again, when you just wake up and you say, I want to actually ensure that I regulate, we'd rather guide. Let's start with regulatory sandboxes. Let's start with, the testing of a RIA, the regulatory impact analysis. Let's first start with those and let's get the lessons learned. And also let's look at who's done it better, who's actually leading in terms of that, and do their circumstances, situations equate to the country that we are actually guiding and we're actually, providing thought leadership to. And then it's a whole nother process that we take to deciding whether or not we want to actually offer full-on advice that, yes, you regulate. But we don't, the first guidance for us is not always, yes, regulate.
Why do, I suppose you did mention it even earlier on, it's the why.
It's the why.
It's the why.
What do you believe? And oftentimes we pick up that it's always the unknown. And so again, I find it a privilege. I'm privileged that I do get called by leaders across the continent to give guidance or advice on, do you believe that this is the right approach for us to take to stop X, Y, and Z? And my first question is always, why? What happened? Because often there is a scenario or there is often a use case to explain. And then my guidance always is, well, let's address the use case. Let's change that. And then if we change that, I can promise you it's going to address the fear or, whatever you believe you may end up, you may think that this is going to happen, but it may not be the case. That may not be the experience.
Okay. As I said earlier, we're going to talk about AI, and you can't have a conversation or a discussion without talking about AI. But I was reading a stat from Gartner which said that 50% of governments worldwide will enforce the use of responsible AI through regulations, policies, and the need for data privacy. And they're predicting that this is going to be by 2026. South Africa already has a national framework around AI. So, and we know that the EU AI Act was now legislation earlier this year. So when regulating or determining policy for AI, what are the fundamentals that we should be looking at as a South Africa, or that should be considered,
So it's very interesting at the roundtable conversation with the DDG, who actually took us through South Africa's AI framework. And again, some of the brightest minds around the table that Cisco had actually convened. And a question did come from one of the participants around, but shouldn't South Africa and Africa be panicked that the EU AI regulation is already out there? And all of the response from everybody around the table was absolutely not. Okay. Simply because it's a brilliant opportunity for us, again, to take out the best practice from what we believe we may want to lean into. And the great thing also is, again, we have a brilliant relationship, by the way, with EU, brilliant relationship with the council and various other committees. So the good thing is we can have an open and engaging conversation with, you've gone ahead and this is what you believe was fit for you.
Okay.
What have you learned from that process? How did you go about getting inputs from an ecosystem of stakeholders? How did you convene for purpose? And once you started to establish that there were certain things that came about and you needed to revisit them, what did you do? And again, our objectives in terms of bridging the digital divide, I can tell you it's very different to what we find globally. So we've got a very unique challenge on the continent. And first and foremost, our unique challenge is, how do we bridge the digital divide? How do we ensure that we take connectivity out to rural areas? What is the most effective, efficient means of connectivity of taking that out? We've got a very unique situation in terms of the sustainability drive that we're actually leading on as Cisco. Pen 1, which is one of our buildings in New York City, is a very smart, sustainable building that has been built with Cisco collaborative technology, actually ensuring that we aligned to how the environment works, to bring down temperatures, to ensure that we operate optimally with our Silicon One chips, to actually ensure we bring down costs to operate with our suppliers, with our customers and partners, etc. So we've got a completely different challenge here when it comes to also ensuring that we bring more women online. How do we ensure that with only 9% of women who are in cybersecurity roles, often do we avoid the biases? How do we ensure that more of the people who are developing the codes and the algorithms are actually diverse individuals?
Yeah.
So how do we also ensure that we tap into and reach into the rural communities to ensure that they are part of the digital journey and they're not going to be left behind? So we have an opportunity to actually have a very conscious and meaningful conversation on all of these aspects which plague us as the continent. And we also have close to 70% of our people that are unconnected across the continent. So again, how do we ensure that we tap into people who have done it before us? And how do we also ensure that we are much more intentional about the evolution of technology and then going back to experts like Cisco and all of us thought leaders who a lot of the governments and industry practitioners tap into? How do we ensure that we are ably equipped with all of this best practice and benchmarks, and we bring it quite comfortably to the table? So again, yes, I know that everybody says there's a race, but then again, the race must also be an ethical one, and it must also be a transparent one, but most importantly, it must also be one that takes into account that entire value chain of citizens who are going to be impacted by AI.
So then we are on this race, we are in this race, and we moving forward. But then do we not run the risk then of, because we're taking all of these things into account, that technology is moving way ahead by the time that something becomes a policy that we focus on, that some of these things are not applicable, some of the things that were put in the thing in the document?
Which is fine because it's not a policy, it's not an act, it's a framework.
Okay.
And I think that's the smart choice
Part
for
of it.
Africa. That's where we are very smart. Because a framework means it's a living, it's a breathing, it's a guiding document. It doesn't prohibit any of us from going out and actually innovating. But at the same time, it gives us that brilliant opportunity that if anything new does come up, we can go and we can. It's a living, it's a breathing document. It's something that moves. Oftentimes, you try to appeal something, or you try to go out and take something to the courts, and then you want to litigate on something. That's where the complexity comes in.
Yeah.
So that's why, again, we all for consultations, we all for roundtable dialogues, we all for regulatory sandboxes, we are all for frameworks and guiding principles and thought leadership. Those are really and truly helping us to ensure that we are not leaving anything out. And again, Simiko, it's so difficult because technology is accelerating at such a phenomenal pace. Sometimes I don't even think that we understand that, yes, we are keeping up. I think sometimes we also, as Africans, we tend to always doubt ourselves and think if we're not done outside, then
Ours is not gonna-
it's not going to work.
Okay.
And so I think sometimes we need to trust the local process. We need to trust that we're collaborating with African Union. We're talking to IT, talking to partners across the continent. We've got the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, which has a large portion of technology that we've all given input into. We've got the digital trade sort of agreements. I think those things are there. And it's not as though Africa and South Africans are sitting in a corner quietly watching the world go by. We actually are very involved in different participatory conversations and engagements.
Seems like there's a lot. Well, I suppose, yeah.
There's a lot. There's a lot that's going on.
Quite a lot. Maybe because we are not in those conversations, that we don't see it, and then you kind of judge it from the outside, I suppose. Yeah. And I know that I had mentioned earlier that there's also this warning of that governments shouldn't regulate for the sake of regulation. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, absolutely. We had a very interesting discussion recently in Botswana with the IIC, and again, a host of different actors from across all different corporate departments and environments in the ICT sector, regulators, policymakers, etc. And we had a very long conversation and debate on when is an opportune time to regulate. But then the question again is, what are you regulating for? So I'm often called up by leaders and I'm told I want to block X, Y, and Z technology. And I want to regulate it to such an extent. And I'm like, why? And what weighs the fear? And often it's the panic of, because if we leave it and we don't know enough about it, then the youth are going to take over and overtake. And we saw across the continent, we found that there were sporadic sort of issues of needing to shut down the internet. It's the worst possible thing that you can do for a continent who relies on the internet. Our SMMEs are relying on, full-on connectivity and being online. Our youth, it's the largest growing youth population globally. They're relying on different technological advancements to remain updated, to stay online. So again, for me, it's often let's solve your perceived use case, or what you believe in your mind, or that's going to be negative. Let's address that. But as far as technology is concerned and the advancements thereof, how can we partner and how do we work together? And again, Simiko, I think a big issue here really is digital skills training and awareness. That definitely needs a stronger lens. And it's one of the reasons why Cisco actually announced 2 years ago at the US Africa Summit that we are going to be equipping Africa with an additional 3 million, skills in the tech sector, because we do believe that with more citizens, more government leaders trained, and they have more comfort in terms of navigating the technological roadmap, the more comfortable they get with dealing with the unknown when it comes to technology policy.
And I suppose, like when you mention on digital skills, if people are skilled in, if they have the digital skills, then they can be their own, like it provides a space to create their own technologies, to create their own businesses, to run their own businesses, to be more maybe an entrepreneurial spirit as well, because now you're
Certainly.
like, I've got all these skills. How do I then make them? If I, like, as we know that the continent has quite a high unemployment rate, not just here in South Africa, but across. Then how do you use those skills to better yourself, not only to better yourself, but to also create employment for yourself, employment
And solve
resume,
Africa's challenges, right? Solve
Yeah.
Africa's challenges. And how do you tap into the ecosystem of Cisco with our experience, design, go-to-market and earn spaces, or, the short version of edge spaces, which are used for incubation and education. And so what you have an opportunity to do is go into the space. We've got now 2 in Johannesburg. We've got 1 in Cape Town. We've got a couple, there's 1 in Pretoria. There's a couple that are spread across the continent. How do you go into these vibrant spaces? How do you meet other techpreneurs? How do you meet other SMMEs and innovators? And how do you start to collaborate to solve Africa's challenges? We've seen some amazing, innovations come through where you are able to innovate on wearables. If you believe that a big challenge across the continent is trafficking, how then do you co-design for that? How do you co-design for things like drones, where we know that to get blood into a lot of parts of rural areas across the continent, you cannot drive, you need to actually send drones with the blood through. Rwanda's been doing a phenomenal job with some SMMEs to actually accelerate that. During COVID, we actually worked with the Baragwanath Hospital and our collaboration technology to actually self-diagnose, to remote diagnose some of the patients. We used online platforms for remote education. A brilliant aspect of these incubation and innovation centers as well is if an SMME, a techpreneur, an entrepreneur comes into the space, they can literally dial into the power of Cisco in Silicon Valley. So they can be dialing in from Kenya, from Rwanda, and tap into a cybersecurity expert or collaboration expert or a data cloud expert in Silicon Valley and say, I'm thinking of the following. Help me unpack my use case or, the business case for the following. They have that power. So again, connectivity, making sure we continue to push safe and secure networks, pushing digital skills and supporting governments in this regard, supporting communities in this regard becomes vital, because you are spot on. How then do we start ensuring that our youth are actually now self-sufficient and they solving Africa's challenges? Not if they solve for the globe, we love that, even better.
Start here.
But how do we start here at home? And again, with the power of collaborative technology.
Okay. And we seeing a lot around we hearing a lot about, fears around the impact of AI on the workforce. What is what do you foresee in that regard? I know there's been a couple of few big people, influential people will be like, no, it's people are not going to lose their jobs. This is not what we're thinking. So, but just for you, from your end, what do you foresee?
Cisco didn't want to guess this. Again, we don't have we're not into the business of guess. No, not. So what we did, we're again very intentional. And what we did with Frank Kutsutis, she actually about a month and a half ago launched an AI consortium report that actually looks at the impact of AI on current and future job roles. And it was a consortium that we did together with Microsoft. We did it with Google, with Intel, and a host of other organizations to actually determine, so how are the current roles actually going to be augmented? How are they going to be influenced? And if there are new roles, where will those new roles be? And most importantly, how does the power of our global classroom Cisco Networking Academy then begin to influence and work to support the reskilling, the relearning, the upskilling of the current and the future roles? So that report is actually underway, and early next year we should actually start having some really well-researched and substantiated outcomes and case studies from this investigative work, just to begin to determine what then is our role. And again, as a company who powers an inclusive future for all, we are responsible for actually leaning in as a thought leader to start to guide governments, to start to guide our partners who actually take our technology to market. And we actually here to actually guide our networking academy communities in terms of look out for the following roles. These are roles that have not even we haven't even started to think of, but these are roles that are going to be highly augmented, and these are roles that are going to be brand new, and these are some of the roles that may no longer exist. And again, a big, I think, intention and conscious intention for us is, if you look at since inception across the continent, we've trained roughly 1.6 million Africans with networking academy skills ranging from AI, cybersecurity, sustainability, networking, how to keep safe online, a whole host of other things. And at least over 400 of those have been women. So our focus is women. And we don't want to have that narrative of, but many of the jobs that are going to be impacted by AI are going to impact women. Like, women have enough on their shoulders. They don't need AI to still have to contend with. So we want to ensure that we catch those early, and we are intentional enough about guiding governments and guiding leaders to say, here is a full stack of our findings in terms of this investigation.
And as someone who has such like a door or such close proximity to some of the decision makers within different African countries, and what are they taking cybersecurity seriously? Like, what is it that you are observing being in those conversations or meeting them, and what is the what's the I don't have the words, but what are they saying around that to you?
So very intentional, and to such an extent that Cisco had the opportunity to actually work with the leaders in Kenya to roll out the first cybersecurity center for the continent. And it's actually at the University of Nairobi. And when Frank Katsudis met with President Ruto in Kenya, and she said to him, we're actually rolling out the very first cybersecurity operating center in the University of Nairobi. He said, oh my goodness, I'm an alumni of that university, so they must have done something right for you to have your first center there.
Over there, yeah.
So again, leaders are understanding that this is required, it's relevant, and we're getting full support. In fact, we've hosted a number of sessions where we've hosted leaders, we've hosted cohorts, and we've had government, different officials coming in to actually really and truly bed down how did they actually excel in terms of cybersecurity training. We also have different leaders coming in to tap into use cases of how do we build cybersecurity resilience in our countries. We're currently working right now in Rwanda with Minister Paula Ngabari, and we're working with her team of rolling out the next cybersecurity center, again, to secure the region, to figure out how then to give government the requisite skills, and of course, how to invite SMMEs and innovators in to actually build on current use cases and actually get around those. Similarly, in Nigeria, we're working with Minister Bosun Tijani, and we're building not just a cybersecurity operating center, but also an AI center and a broadband center to take connectivity out into the rural areas. So governments are paying attention. They're sitting up and they're paying attention because I think they're starting to understand and realize, and this is actually a quote that stuck in my head from a few years ago when I joined Cisco. The then chairperson of Cisco and the CEO, John Chambers, said there's only two organizations in this world, those who are hacked and those who know that they've been hacked.
Yeah.
And I think they're starting to come to that realization. I also believe that because of the lack of clearly defined processes inside of government when it comes to how you respond. And if you look at South Africa as a whole, we still have the Cyber Crimes Act. That one it's been assented to, but still has to be rolled out. We're still looking at how do you actually execute in this? And I think there's about very 28% of companies that have signed up for the Malabo Convention. So that's another big issue because there are certain countries who need to agree on certain protocols, and we need to agree on how we actually show up when there are these different compromises. And I think the final one is just when somebody is hacked, it's very rare that they're going to admit. because I feel customer lot. So oftentimes they're not always comfortable and confident enough to reach out and say, I have an issue. So governments are now sitting up and paying attention, just in terms of how then do we actually become more resilient? How do we protect government infrastructure? And most importantly, how do we protect the citizens of the country? And we have been at the forefront in terms of not just thought leadership, but collaborating on, deploying technology, deploying tools and processes, and ensuring that we deploy our people as well.
Awesome. Charmaine, our conversation is not just going to be on policy and everything. Just maybe as like to end our conversation, just to find out from you in terms of what are some of what book or podcast are you currently listening to, so that as someone who's in policy and who strategizes and who helps governments, and what is like an important book that you are reading or a podcast that you're listening to now at the moment?
Actually, I'm currently, I have a very short attention span. So I read 4 or 5 books because something actually just bores me. But one of them that I'm finding interesting is on Elon Musk. Okay. So again, just because the fact he's South African, and there's been a lot of talk about his whole like Starlink, and many leaders met him recently on the sidelines of United Nations General Assembly. I attended as well. And I've just been fascinated also by his own narrative when it comes to, where he sees AI and especially robots and what he believes their role is going to be. So again, I've been reading up a lot about him and his journey and listening in also on a lot of his podcasts and following a lot of that. So I think top of mind, that's what I'm actually focusing on right now. And I've also been quite impressed, and I think I've also been quite, interested in his own dynamics leading up to the United States elections and the role that he played in terms of influencing and advising. And again, as somebody who loves thought and who loves, talking to people and who loves collaborating, I'm just wondering, what can I actually take away from that? Is there anything for me to learn? And then always a firm favorite for me is Brene Brown. So I'm always listening to her podcasts on the power of vulnerability. I'm always listening to her just in terms of, imposter syndrome, and as a woman working in an industry that's largely male dominated. I've been quite fortunate with the host and with quite a number of mentors and sponsors that I've had. Very, very fortunate to work with powerful people, amazing women like Smangile and Kosi, who the two of us are actually very, very close. We talk like 5-6 times a day, aligning on Cisco in South Africa. Some of my other female colleagues across the continent, we're very close. I'm very close to the sponsor, Frank Katsudis. And I think a lot of these women actually had made it possible for me to shine my light. So again, I'm always looking to understand, how do I keep, showing up? And I think for me, Brene has been such a brilliant, I think, just guide in terms of how to keep your cup full.
Awesome. Charmaine, it was awesome having you here and talking all things policy. I think a big takeaway from me is that as much as you would think policy is, like we said, it's a cumbersome space, or it's all about, regulation and not necessarily wanting advancements in tech or all of that, not necessarily wanting, but like trying to police or have guardrails. But the main important question that in doing this, that leaders or the people that are actually behind that need to ask is the why.
The why.
The why is the most important. And I suppose also having frameworks where you can tweak and have, like a little, as we are moving with the tech, but also be able to adjust whatever you've put on the table and make it applicable for the time and period. So it was really interesting to hear, and also I suppose with what Cisco's doing around digital skills and cybersecurity. Very interesting insights. Thank you so much for coming to join us on the show, and we look forward to having you next time again.
Thank you. And I think most importantly, whilst we think it's all about the policy and the words, in the end, it's really about the people. And just like we always think it's about the technology, it's really about the person behind the technology. So oftentimes we say AI is coming, but most important is the person who's going to be managing the AI and the person who's going to be ensuring that they use AI to augment what they're doing. And I think that's how I look at policy. It's not about the words, not about the document, but it's about the ecosystem of people and humanity that I actually have access to actually collaborate with and partner with and ensure change.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was Charmaine Houvet. She is the Senior Director of Government Strategy at Cisco Africa.